大家好，今天我们非常荣幸邀请到柬埔寨皇家研究院院长顾问Digby James Wren 先生。今天呢，我们的主题呢是中国和澳大利亚与太平洋岛国关系的角色和影响。这个问题呢，因为 Digby 先生他是澳大利亚人，所以呢，对于中国、澳大利亚在kangaroos
and koalas.
we have to say that Australia is a colony of
the United
Kingdom.
Yeah.
And Pacific Island also as a colony, and it's in
English, well, actually, the Spanish. Spanish, and then the English and the French, and then the Americans, and the Japanese, of course, also attempted to colonize some of the islands.
Yes. 所以呢，中国和太平洋岛国呢，最近十几年的关系呢，发展比较迅速。那么在这里面就有一个问题，就是澳大利亚政府和人民，就是 how Australia, recent about a decade, China also developed their diplomacy with Pacific Island countries. Up to now, already have 11 Pacific Island countries, have a diplomatic relation with China.
Yeah.
Only 3 left.
Yes, 3. Very, very small ones.
Small ones.
That's the Federated Association of, what is it? The Associated... what did they call the Associated Federation of Islands? Anyway, which is basically directly under U.S. control.
Yes.
They have no defense policy, no foreign policy.
Yes. So
no sovereignty.
Yeah, but we, Australia government, unlike, China has relationship with Pacific Island countries. Sometimes they have to accept, but they always still mind of thinking as the backyard of Australia. But nowadays, even small country, they are, claim their own sovereignty very much. So what do you think China, has developed their diplomacy relations with Pacific Islands? At the same time, what is the Australia government and even Australia people, what their view about this?
So that's sort of 3 questions. So I'll take them in order. I suppose the first thing to think about is the original colonization of those islands. In the modern era, I'm talking about, because clearly those islands and they're ethnically and religiously very different. They're not all the same. It's not as if all these islands are exactly the same kind of people. That's not true at all. So Vanuatu, for example, has the same ethnic origins as Cambodians and Taiwanese, which is very interesting. But other islands, have Melanesia, so that's very much the same as Papua New Guinea, and then others are Polynesian, so much like Samoa, Tonga, Hawaii, for example, is Polynesian. I mean, that's an extraordinary feat of navigation that they were able to get to these islands in the first place is kind of amazing. But then they established, I suppose, quite sophisticated systems of management, and they were very well organized. They weren't really fighting each other all the time, not so much, but they were quite warlike, I think, at the beginning. But not all of them, just some of them. But James Cook, for example, who's the famous United Kingdom navigator, who's sort of, the myth is that he discovered Australia, which of course is not true. But there's no doubt that he was an extraordinary navigator. But he ended up being killed by the natives, the Polynesians on Hawaii. So then, because he was trying to trick them into something, and didn't work out. So, but look, the whole thing really started, I suppose, in the late or mid 19th century, when the Americans decided they were going to they went from coast to coast, from sea to sea, from sea to shining sea, as they say. But then they needed fertilizer for all of their fertilizer for their agriculture in the United States. And so that many of these islands, these small islands, had really large sources of what they call guano, which is, basically bird poo. And it accumulated over millions of years, literally. And this stuff is great fertilizer. So they would just go and scrape this stuff off, and they kept sort of finding more islands and sort of expanded across the Pacific during the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, until, eventually they got to the Philippines, and we all know what happened there in Teddy Roosevelt's time, McKinley and then Roosevelt. There was one of the most violent suppressions of a people ever on the Philippine Islands. More than 2 million Filipinos died. That was General MacArthur's father who instigated that. But look, this is all to say that all of these islands have not had any real sovereignty since the British and the French sailed into the Pacific, and the Spanish before that, and then the Americans kind of continued that. There was a brief interlude, more violent interlude with the Japanese, but they didn't really exploit those islands in the same way. And then Australia was always the largest of all of the islands, so to speak. And so they're quite close in real terms. I mean, you were just saying that, you have to fly to Australia basically first before you can get to these other islands, and New Zealand too, right?
Yes.
But then quite often you go to Australia before you go to New Zealand, because New Zealand's sort of further south. And so Australia started sort of also being let's say, an outpost, if you like. But so all of the larger ports and the markets were based out of Australia, and so they would run the networks to go and get resources from these islands. So, for example, phosphates and fertilizers. But then they also started using the local islanders as labor, cheap labor, and they brought them in. They called them Kanaks. And so this just meant the islanders, basically, and they would be brought into sugar plantations in north of Australia as extremely cheap labor. But they weren't allowed to stay. So they were then, when the season ended, they would have to be shipped back. Some managed to stay, but most did not. And so I suppose since that time, for at least 120 years, something like that, Australia has had a very kind of colonial, indirectly colonial, in the sense that it was the UK or the French or the Americans that were sort of controlling that. But it was based out of Australia, and the Australians took the attitude, a paternal attitude, which is based in a lot of the missionary work, so that paternalism, so like sort of the civilized white father or mother going and civilizing these native people on these islands who ran around without clothes because the weather is so perfect. Why would you need to get all dressed up? And so they turned them into good little Christians, and that you can see that is still true today. I think is it Tonga. They still have Sundays. You can't even land an airplane in Tonga on a Sunday. Sunday law.
Sunday law, very strict.
Yes, sort of controlling, because everybody has to go to church, and so that's taken hold in a very big way. And Australia really developed a kind of a colonial, paternal attitude and approach to all of these islands, and started to exploit them as cheap labor. But of course, that's not what the Pacific Islands want.
Yeah. Australia very worried about China. If they have a good relationship with Pacific Island countries, they might challenge Australia their control position to the Oceania and the Pacific Island countries, and also Pacific, and they also worry about Australia as their traditional security partners. And now some of the Pacific Island countries, they might choose China as actually both. They are both with Australia and China as their security partnership, but Australia are a bit worried about this. Why they so worried?
Well, the first thing is whether or not it was China or some other power in the Pacific, so for Japan, for example, or even the French and the Russians. In the late 19th century, there was a great worry that the Russians were going to come and start colonizing islands and so forth and so on. And the French, and there'd always been that competition between the French and the English anyway. And the French still have a lot of islands, Tahiti and New Caledonia, where there was recently another uprising in New Caledonia. But they're not going to get, they're definitely not going to get any sovereignty, succession. They're not going to break away. And that's because one of the larger islands, and it's got a very, very large nickel mine. And if you go and look at the nickel prices, you'll see why the French don't want to give that up. And that might be also related to what just recently happened in Africa, where the French had been taking all the gold and the mineral assets, and those poor countries in North Africa that were French colonies are still, well, three of the poorest countries. And so this is true again of the Pacific Islands. They have very, very limited resources. I mean, they have enough agricultural resource to sort of feed a small population. And of course, with the coming of ships from America and Australia, which are especially Australia is the closest large country. New Zealand is still quite a small country, and although it does have fairly good relations with most of the islands, I'd say better than the Australians. But the thing here is, and I think that what really worried them was, the French would kind of colonize the islands, get closer and closer, and perhaps make a claim on Australian territory. And you can see that there was some worry about that because the Napoleonic Wars, and then later also the Germans came in the late 19th century or early 20th century, and they colonized Papua New Guinea, for example, was a German colony. And some of the other islands, escapes me which ones were the German. It was the German Marshall Islands. It was the Marshall. I think it was the Marshall Islands. And there's a couple of others.
Before Samoa and the German.
Yes, German Samoa, right?
Yeah, German Samoa, then transferred to New Zealand.
Right, and then with the Versailles Treaty after World War I, all those islands were taken away from the Germans and given to the UK. And Papua New Guinea was made a protectorate of Australia.
Yes.
So Australia became a colonial master over the biggest of all the islands, which is Papua and New Guinea.
Yes.
And that's only half the island. The other half, West Irian Jaya, which had been Dutch, and because Indonesia had been colonized by the Dutch. And that's a Pacific island as well. It's not. But then that stretches across out into. So these Pacific islands are basically divided into two groups: the southern group and the northern group, and that they always kind of a little bit of tension between them. But I think that's very normal. It's sort of like Beijing and Shanghai, or Sydney and Melbourne, or something like that. New York and Washington, whatever it is. That seems quite normal to me. But they're clearly trying to work together, because when you're all small, the only way that you're ever going to get something is if you're joined together.
Yes.
So they know that. And the other thing that changed, of course, was education improved. Now, one thing you can say about the missionaries and the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Americans and so forth is that they did invest a small amount of money and effort into education. And the reason, of course, is you need an educated elite to run the place. Yes. But they didn't educate everybody.
Yes.
The others all just had to go to church, so their education became singing. And you can see that in all of the islander communities, they all many of them have become pop stars because they had wonderful voices, and they learned all of that in church. So and they sing every Sunday because they're not allowed to do anything else.
Yeah.
But no, so that's okay. That's there's some kind of cultural heritage in there, and I think everybody likes that actually. But Australia thought that, look, this could be island hopping. So the Japanese had island hop. So they went from one island and then staged to the next island and so forth. And so the fear in the Australians is that this might happen again. So first it was the Germans and the Russians and the French and everything, and Americans, they weren't too worried about the Americans because, well, there's some kind of cultural Anglo thing going on, and that seemed more approachable. And the Americans would always throw money at us, at Australia or at the islands, but not very much money, but just enough to sort of keep people not so worried. And the French, settled their problems with the British, and so they all thought they were sitting pretty.
Yeah.
But then with the rise of China after World War II, and the Americans, of course, had really kind of done a very strong expansionist colonial sort of program after World War II, where they thought these islands are going to be very, very important in controlling the Pacific, and specifically the Western Pacific, and the access to the trade routes. And so they really set about colonizing these islands and stripping them of sovereignty. And we remember, all of us, that the French and the Americans and the British exploded, I'm not sure how many, but something like 170 nuclear weapons on these islands. Yeah. And some of the peoples and the families from nearby islands still suffer terribly from diseases.
The Marshall Island.
Yeah, and deformities and all sorts of sicknesses and illnesses, which did they ever have any exercise of sovereignty about this? No, they didn't. And that's why they wanted a nuclear-free Pacific. They've been very vociferous. They've, really cried out for this. And they've been ignored terribly. AUKUS is an example of that. More nuclear power, more nuclear. But so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is so economic and so forth. Well, these islanders have always been poor, and one of the ways they were controlled was a certain amount of them were given scholarships, for example, things like that, and trained up. That's the sort of elites, so they could manage the colonies, if you like. And the second one was that some of the islanders got their people into good universities, and they started to learn about how things really work, economics and administration and organization and so forth. And so now all of the islands basically have got groups of people who are quite well educated, and they're not falling for the old tricks, and they want independence, and in a large degree they got some independence, with the post-colonial era, but they were still very dependent, and the only way they could get any money was basically to beg for it, because they don't have enough money to build ships or or transport or infrastructure between the islands. They're very, very limited. Very small boats, only small boats doing that, and they don't have enough land to have agricultural production that they can export. So what can they export? So that's problematic, and Australia used that to exercise control, because it just meant, well, we'll take some of your people, and they can come and work for us seasonally, like they had 100 years ago on sugar farms. I think that was still happening in the 1960s. That they were taking the islanders and working seasonally and then sending them back again. And so, but that was an important thing for the islanders, because it was sort of cash in hand, and they could maybe fix their house or something, upgrade some facilities. But of course, now with modern education from internationally, more communication, all those sorts of things, well, they discovered that, well, hang on a second, maybe we could just get some help from China or from other places. And some of those places were Taiwan, for example, and China. And that's why you have that split in the islands. The Americans sort of had them all recognizing Taiwan and not the PRC.
They make use of the one China policy.
Yes.
Then they make use of this. It's like a competition, so they took the advantage. But now we don't care about the Taiwan is part of China.
That's
and
right.
No matter what you want to do, if you are with Taiwan, we can't help you.
Basically, like that.
Yeah.
Yes. So those freely associated islands, there's basically only 3 left. No foreign policy. They're completely dominated by Washington. They just signed another treaty, which is going to lock them in for another 10 years of poverty, basically. And all they're doing is hosting US troops and US forces. Nothing else is happening. Yeah. And the most famous of those fertilizer islands was Nauru, which is the most recent one to recognize PRC.
Yeah.
Really against the wishes of the Australians and the Americans. I mean, must have been a very difficult choice with all the political pressure they got, and they were promised a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the Australians basically woke up to the idea that, oh, hang on a second, the Chinese are now offering these people, these post-colonial populations, they're offering them access to infrastructure and resources they didn't have before, and the Australians and the Americans had never given them, never. And that meant they suddenly had a good port that they could get a little bigger ship into, and then now they could trade between the islands. They had an airport that would take long-haul flights, so you could fly directly from, say, Australia. Whereas previously the airstrips were quite small and they just had small aircraft, relatively small aircraft. Maybe a 100-seater would be maximum, the very maximum. But now you can get 747, get large aircraft into there, C919s, for example. And so that is a big boon. Buildings, infrastructure, for example, administrative infrastructure, libraries, parliaments or assembly buildings, things like that. Water protection, drainage, pumps, all sorts of, all the useful stuff that you want to be able to run a kind of modern society, digital infrastructure, for example, and access to satellites, things like that, things that they could never afford by themselves. And so the Chinese have said, well, hang on, look, you do have resources. They've got an economic zone that stretches out basically 300 kilometers. And there's enormous amounts of fish, of course, and development of that. They do have some agricultural land, especially the larger islands like Fiji. I think Tonga has, some agriculture, not really for export, but New Guinea does, definitely. They can export, Fiji can export. But if they work, the idea was they're all going to work together, right? And the Chinese were going to help establish that and help them do that. And really the only thing that they had to do was say to themselves, well, are we supporting Taiwan or are we supporting the One China policy exactly as it's written out in the United Nations? Because one has to remember, of course, that both Australia and the United States recognize One China.
Yes.
So there's an essential hypocrisy in there.
Yes.
And those islanders have now been to university.
But even...
that's hypocritical. Why would we do that? And you've got a two-face problem going on here. And China's just saying, hey, listen, we'll give you some infrastructure and connect you up. And then as you get, and we'll provide you with a market. But you don't have to just sell to us. You can sell to anybody. It's up to you. And so there's big benefits in education, in infrastructure, and in connecting to trade networks, which had existed actually for a long time beforehand in a very small scale, but across oceans. And that had virtually been destroyed by the colonial masters.
But even Australia think China can help Pacific Island countries. Even Australia could not do it before. But still, you think from the government, like the leaders' election, do you think they can keep their own sovereignty for election? Or at the back, U.S. or Australia will disturb, like recent election from Solomon Island.
Yes.
Sogawale give up the election. He says himself and his family be very much disturbed. He didn't say by who, but
external influence.
Yes. Why could they leave the independent for the Pacific Island for their own election, or they want?
Well, it's a pattern, isn't it? I mean, we all know it's a pattern of external influence and subversion of freely elected governments. So, there's the insistence that they have elections, and then when the elections don't go the way that some external forces want, then they're perfectly happy to interfere and try and overturn that. So they get a government that's friendly.
Okay.
And that's what's happened in the Solomons, and that there's a very long story in all of that. And basically, those are the Solomons and Papua New Guinea. Very, very sort of triangulates with the very north of eastern Australia. So Queensland has a very pointy tip that goes up right up to almost touches Papua New Guinea. And then just sort of the other side of the triangle is going out to the Solomons and Samoa and so forth, and then other islands coming down. So big triangle, if you like. And those islands, they all wanted to put in undersea cable for communications, so fiber optics and all those sorts of things. And a Chinese company won the contract, best price.
Yes.
It was an open deal. Anybody could have applied, and one of the Australian companies, not Singapore, it wasn't Singtel, it's Tesla. Sorry, not Tesla. What am I saying? Testra. What's the name of that Australian company?
Australia company.
Telstra. Sorry, excuse me. Telstra. And they couldn't outbid the Chinese company.
Yeah.
And anyway, Huawei, I think, and well, it had the best technology as well. So, so what the Australians did was they applied enormous amount of pressure on these countries, enough for them to cancel the contract, break the contract, which they had to pay for. They don't have any money, and they had to pay for this, right?
Yeah.
And then the Australians said, well, the Australian government will lend you the money. So now, instead of being a private installation, business, which is what is being promoted, they then turn around again hypocritically and say, oh, the Australian government's going to pay for the whole thing. You don't have to pay for it. So we'll just do it for you. But what this also meant was that now all their communications had to go to Australia. But the only condition was all of the islands were connected to Australia first. And then they're connected back out into the global network, which meant effectively that Australia can mediate and interfere with all of the communications of all of those islands.
Is it related to Five Eyes strategy?
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
There's no doubt that
definitely.
that all of that communication can now be monitored and tracked.
Yeah.
Although blockchain might cause some problems, but yeah. So that was, so then the Australian taxpayers are now funding the infrastructure as opposed to a private contract, which everybody was happy with. And it's not the best stuff either.
Yeah.
And it can be controlled. So it's not a good outcome.
Yeah.
And that included New Guinea.
Okay.
That included New Guinea. So even New Guinea now, instead of going directly into Indonesia and up, they have to go back down to Australia first. All their communications then monitored through Australia. So I don't know, if I was a government of any kind of government, I'd be like, I don't think that's a good idea. But it is, and that's what's happened. And it was Australian taxpayers. And that is, of course, so what they've done is they've basically set up they've basically, what would you say, sort of firewalled or sort of, island chain the communications of the whole Western Pacific. So all those islanders do not have independent communications. So that's making, I think that's quite difficult, and that's sort of colonial, colonial communications, if you like.
Colonial system.
Yeah, system.
Being up and tidy up.
Yeah. And so Australia is still acting in this very colonial way.
Yeah. And
I think all the islanders just are really up to here with it. They're really very, very tired of all of this, and they don't want it. But, the realities are that there's still a lot of money coming from the Americans and from the Australians, and then there's a lot of pressure, political pressure.
Yes, yeah.
And then there's the kind of advantages of education and a very long relationship, especially with Christianity.
Yes, yeah.
That connects them to communities in Australia. The missionaries are still always there. You can go to any of these islands, you'll still see white missionaries walking around, telling everybody that God told them they needed to have Telstra and not Huawei. So that's the Australian view on it, and they've never really. And even today, Penny Wong, who's a Malaysian Chinese, went to Australia. Now she's the foreign minister. Strangely has carried this attitude forward. Is still doing the same thing. Like just calling it Australia's backyard. You belong to us. You're our land. You're our territory. Or that we're all one family. And so, do you tell me which family forces half their family into semi-slavery? I mean, I don't know many families like that. So but the islanders know this, and that's why they're all changing away from the Taiwan. They're forced to do that by the Americans and the Australians, and they've all turned away, and they've said, no, we want to work with China because it doesn't come with conditions. The conditions are purely that if we want to sell to China, we can, because now we have a port. If we want to hold free elections, we've got a parliament building. The Australians didn't build them a parliament building. And they could have. So it's really like they've had more than 100 years to help these islanders set sort of, some kind of independence and sovereignty, and it could have been done. It could have been done. It really could have. But now it's China that's offering them the best hope. And so they've been playing China off against the Australians, and why shouldn't they? I mean, you want to get the best deal you can. And so they got the smarts about that now. And so they've been getting a pretty good deal. In many ways. It could be better, but it's definitely improved enormously. And I met, when I was teaching at a couple of universities in China, I met a lot of students from Samoa and the Solomons and Vanuatu. I met a lot of students doing advanced university degrees, not undergraduate degrees. masters, PhDs, and in economics, administration, finance, policy, all the things that you need for good governance.
One thing is why Australia is so worried about they pretend China will build a military base in Pacific Island countries, and plus why Australia is so worried about its own security. They be attacked, or I don't think in Australia history they don't have any kind of security problem. So
There's
why
never
they
been.
so,
There's
why
never.
they so
Well,
worried about?
except what I said before about when there was that age of expansion, imperial expansion, so they were colonizing islands.
Yes.
I mean that basically ended after World War II, except for the Americans.
Yes,
they kept doing it.
Yes.
And the Australians kind of just followed along. That was, I suppose, a very big mistake, and especially seeing how Australia was a colony.
Yes.
It seems really strange to do that.
Yes.
But look, the fear. There's always that fear of, it's a white Anglo-Saxon outpost in the middle of the Pacific and sort of Asia, and that fear has been in Australia at least since the 1820s, when gold was first discovered, and Chinese would come there as semi-slave labor, indentured. They were basically indentured labor. The Chinese were indentured labor. They couldn't bring women. They couldn't have families, and they had to work for a year to pay back the ship that brought them, and then they'd have to work however many more years to get enough money, and then they were sent back. Now, some of them didn't. Some of them managed to stay, and so you have some Chinese communities along the coast of Australia from that period. But the real, I suppose, at the very heart of it is an essential kind of a racist view of the world about white people and the expansion of white colonies across the world. And then there's also the Christian element to it. And then the final element is that, now China is so big, so powerful, so advanced. And it's very convenient to use that as a way of mobilizing and aligning with the AUKUS and the Five Eyes and, NATO in Asia sort of idea. That's where it's gone. But Australia had formerly not worried about that, really. It's been a big push from the Americans, especially under Obama. And then Trump wasn't really too concerned about it because it was already in play. Obama had already set it on. So Trump didn't really adjust any of that. He didn't really change it at all. He just said, okay, that's fine. Budgets are approved, policies are approved. We'll just keep doing that. That's okay. But he didn't really care too much about that. He was more interested in other things. Trade relations, and he imposed tariffs on the Koreans and the Japanese, and and on Australia, and then it used to be that Australian defence was what they called the Northern Arc. So from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, all the north of Australia, that was the only thing that Australia was interested in being able to defend. So its own territorial waters, its own sovereignty out to about 300 k's. And that's really all we did. And we do cooperation with Singapore and Malaysia and so forth. And that's sort of also a sort of colonial kind of idea, right? British colonial in Malaysia and Singapore, and Indonesia with the Dutch, right? And interestingly, it's all those countries that signed the treaty that gives America this legal loophole about Taiwan. Those same countries, those former colonizing powers, the same ones, the same six. Now, India refused to sign those documents. They said it's imperialism. We don't want to have anything to do with it. And they didn't go to the San Francisco Treaty. But so Australia is now, yes, it's in full threat mode, or at least it was a couple of years ago, to the extent that they actually had a newspaper headlines in the Melbourne papers and the Sydney papers with a big red cover thing saying war with China.
Wow.
I know, it's unbelievable, right? I mean, this is pure manipulation of public opinion. And so clearly they're just saying, okay, look, the Chinese are going to build bases on these islands. But the reality is that only the Americans and the British and the French have built bases on any of these islands. There are no Chinese bases on any of them, and there never has been. I'm not going to say there never will be, but one never knows the future. But I don't think so. That has never been the Chinese policy. I don't think there's any evidence there is no evidence of this in any way, shape or form. There was some allegations. They've floated a few stories. First it was Vanuatu, you're going to expand the port. Oh, well, it's dual use. Well, I don't think I've ever been to a port that wasn't dual use. The idea, that a port is only for commercial vessels, can't have a small naval vessel, this is silly. Every port is dual use. Every airport is dual use. Every toilet is dual use.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, they have a big imagination.
Yeah, there's a big imagination. No, but this is clearly manipulation of the narrative for other purposes.
Yes.
And the purpose, of course, is that the first island chain, all of these other islands are staging posts to maintain the first island chain and contain China. Now, it's all sold as deterrence. They're deterring something. But one needs to wonder, they're deterring, what are they deterring? They're deterring themselves, perhaps, because they're the ones that are colonizing and building these military bases. So, there's no evidence. I'm an Australian scholar. I've been studying this a very long time. I've been writing about it for a long time. And I have found no evidence. Zero evidence. It just doesn't exist. And if you wanted to go much deeper into this, you will find very, very quickly that it's driven by external security forces.